Welcome to Search the Scriptures. We are on study 8 today in the book of 1 Kings, and this study covers 1 Kings chapter 9 verse 1 through chapter 10 and verse number 13. And we're going to attempt to answer two different sets of questions in this study today. The first one is this: comparing 9:3 carefully with 8:29. In 9:3, Solomon asked God to listen to the prayers that are prayed at the temple and to have his eye always watching on the temple. So when you compare 9:3 with 8:29, in what two respects did God exceed Solomon's request? Observe all the close relation between God's promise and his commands, and between his fulfillment of his promise and man's obedience. What do we see in this passage today of the fulfillment to Solomon of God's promise in chapter 3, verses 12 through 13, when he would give him wisdom and all the people of the earth would see that wisdom and recognize that God has blessed him? Question number 2, in what ways is the Queen of Sheba an example to us, and consider the purpose of her visit, the difficulties of it, and her reward? Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 9 verse 1 through chapter 10 and verse number 13 together. 1 Kings 9:1, when Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, and had achieved all he had desired to do. So this took about 20 years at least. The Lord appeared to him a second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard the prayer and the plea that you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and the decrees that I have given you, and if you go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and I will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among peoples. This temple will become a heap of rubble, and all who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? And people will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their ancestors out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them. At the end of 20 years, during which Solomon built these two buildings, the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, King Solomon gave 20 towns in Galilee to Hiram, king of Tyre, because Hiram had supplied him with all the cedar and juniper and the gold that he wanted. But when Hiram went from Tyre to see the towns that Solomon had given him, he was not pleased with them. What kind of towns are these that you have given me, my brother? He asked, and he called them the land of Kabul, a name that they have to this day. Now Hiram had sent to the king 120 talents of gold. That's 4.5 metric tons of gold. And here is the account of the forced labor King Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple, his own palace, the terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had attacked and captured Gezer. He had set it on fire. He had killed its Canaanite inhabitants, and then gave it as a wedding gift to his daughter, Solomon's wife. And Solomon rebuilt Gezer, and he built up Lower Beth Horon, Baalath, and Tadmor in the desert within his land, as well as his store cities and the towns for his chariots and for his horses. Whatever he desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and throughout all the territory, he ruled. There were still people left from the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. These people were not Israelites, and Solomon conscripted the descendants of all these peoples remaining in the land, whom the Israelites could not exterminate, to serve as slave labor, as it is to this day. But Solomon did not make slaves of any of the Israelites. They were his fighting men, his government officials, his officers, his captains, and the commanders of his chariots and charioteers. They were also the chief officials in charge of Solomon's projects, 550 officials supervising those who did the work. After Pharaoh's daughter had come up from the city of David to the palace that Solomon had built for her, he constructed the terraces. 3 times a year Solomon sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings on the altar that he had built for the Lord, burning the incense before the Lord along with them, and so fulfilled the temple obligations. King Solomon also built ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath Edom on the shore of the Red Sea, and Hiram sent his men, sailors who knew the sea, to serve in the fleet with Solomon's men, and they sailed to Ophir and brought back 420 talents of gold, which they delivered to King Solomon. When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relationship to the Lord, she came to test Solomon with hard questions. Arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold, and precious stones, she came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind. And Solomon answered all her questions, and nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba saw the wisdom of Solomon and the palace that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, the burnt offerings he'd made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. She said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw them with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me in wisdom and wealth that you have far succeeded the report that I heard. How happy your people must be, how happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness." And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, 4.5 metric tons, large quantities of spices and precious stones. Never again were so many spices brought in as those the Queen of Sheba gave to Solomon. And Hiram's ships brought gold from Ophir, and from there they brought great cargoes of almug wood and precious stones. The king used almug wood to make supports for the temple of the Lord and for the royal palace, and to make harps and lyres for the musicians, so that much amalgam was never been imported or since that day. And King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all that she desired and asked for, and besides what he had given her out of his royal bounty. Then she left and returned with her retinue to her own country. Well, let's look at the first question. Compare 9:3 carefully with 8:29. It's in 8:29 that Solomon asked that God would hear the prayers in the temple. In what 2 respects did God exceed Solomon's request? And observe all the close relation between God's promise and his commands, between his fulfillment of his promise and man's obedience. And what do we see in today's passage of the fulfillment to Solomon of God's promise? Well, God's eyes, his ears, his name, and his heart, God says, are going to be permanently associated with the temple that Solomon built. There's a however. This divine promise of God hinged on the obedience of Solomon and the obedience of the future generations. Failure to remain faithful in obedience to the Lord's commands would result in the confiscation of the land, the destruction of the temple, the removal of the line of Solomon from the throne of God. Up to this point, Solomon had been true to the Lord, and the Lord had been true to his promise. The Lord always is true to his promises. Solomon's fame had spread throughout the whole world. The Queen of Sheba brings him a gift of 4.5 metric tons of gold. Just so happens to be what it seems that he owed Hiram, king of Tyre. God has a way of taking care of his people. The Queen of Sheba was amazed at Solomon's wisdom, and she showered him with gifts. Solomon truly would lack nothing as long as he abided in the Lord through obedience to the Lord's commands. And we won't lack anything that we need either if we will stay firm in the Word of God. The second question, in what ways is the Queen of Sheba an example to us, and consider the purpose of her visit, the difficulties of it, and her reward? Well, people notice. I think that's the example it serves to us. They recognize the touch of God on our lives. Whether they can explain it or not, they recognize it. Most of the time, they won't acknowledge it for what it is, but occasionally there will be a Queen of Sheba that God will send to do his will. And he moves in mysterious ways, and he will use the wealth of this world, which ultimately all belongs to him, to bless us in ways that many times we least expect it. We can't overlook the fact that she did not leave empty-handed, though. Not only did Solomon bless her with his wisdom, he also blessed her with gifts as well. This seems to have been some sort of a trade negotiation between two very powerful kingdoms. When the world blesses us in ways that we don't expect the world to bless us, we need to bless them with the wisdom of God. We need to make sure that they do not leave empty-handed. We need to have something in our spiritual royal storage to offer them. If you do search the scriptures every day, you're going to have something to offer them, something that has far more value than gold, spices, or precious stones. Hope you've enjoyed the study today. Hope you're having a great day so far. May God richly bless the rest of your day.